Good morning, atheist, agnostic, skeptic, freethinker, naysayer, rebel, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium, not from the website either. So let's say our creed, just so newcomers are aware of what it is that we do believe. Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So we do it every Sunday. If you come and you enjoy church, please consider making a donation. We have a jar at the back of the room, and you can also donate off of Meetup. The donations go just to rent this room. That's it. News. First Friday of the month, we have a movie, and our movie is going to be called Saved. So it's a comedy. Please sign up for the website if you'd like to come. Spaces are limited. I think that's it for the news. So please come on up, Steve. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you everyone for coming today. So today, this is a surprise, I'm going to talk about the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. And David Hume is particularly relevant to our church because he was a famous atheist. He was the Richard Dawkins of his day, and which is kind of shocking if you remember that he lived between 1711 and 1776. So, took some bravery to be an atheist then. The reason I'm interested in Hume is he was immensely influential on future philosophers and also on a number of other fields like psychology. He was friends with Adam Smith, who founded modern economics, and Benjamin Franklin. In fact, the biographer Walter Isaacson attributes Hume's influence as the reason that Benjamin Franklin made a crucial change to the Declaration of Independence. You can see this change if you go to the Library of Congress. It's on display. They have a rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. And in it, Jefferson had originally written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." That's what it said in the original version. And then Franklin scratched that out and wrote instead, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And this small change changed the moral foundations of the Declaration of Independence. Walter Isaacson writes, "By using the word sacred, Jefferson had asserted, intentionally or not, that the principle in question, the equality of men and their endowment by their creator with inalienable rights, was an assertion of religion. Franklin's edit turned it instead into an assertion of rationality." So a pretty big change, scratching out that one phrase. David Hume died in 1776 because he was a famous atheist at the time. Got a lot of attention because everyone was secretly hoping that he would, repent for his atheism on his deathbed and say, "Oh, it was all a mistake." So Samuel Boswell documented the last moments of Hume's life. He went out there, he visited with Hume on his deathbed, and he writes, "I found him alone, in a reclining posture in his drawing room. He was lean, ghastly, and quite of an earthy appearance. He was dressed in a suit of gray cloth with white metal buttons and a kind of scratch wig. He was quite different from the plump figure which he used to present. He had before him Dr. Campbell's Philosophy of Rhetoric. He seemed to be placid and even cheerful. He said he was just approaching to his end. I know not how I contrived to get to the subject of immortality introduced." We know, everyone was asking about that. So he sneakily brought up this subject. He said he never had entertained any belief in religion since he had begun to read John Locke and Samuel Clarke. I asked him if he was not religious when he was young. He said he was. He then flatly said that the morality of every religion was bad, and I really thought was not jocular when he said that when he had heard a man was religious, he concluded that he was a rascal, though he had known some instances of very good men being religious. This was just an extravagant reverse of the common remark as to infidels. Anyway, I had a strong curiosity to be satisfied if he persisted in disbelieving a future state, even when he had death before his eyes. I was persuaded from what he now said, and from his manner of saying it, that he did persist. I asked him if it was not possible that there might be a future state. He answered it was possible that a piece of coal upon the fire would not burn, and he added that it was a most unreasonable fancy that we should exist forever. Mr. Lauder, his surgeon, came in for a little, and Mr. Muir, the Baron's son, for another small interval. He was, as far as I could judge, quite easy with both. He said he had no pain, but was wasting away. I left him with impressions which disturbed me for some time. So the reason I dwelled a little bit on that was this was a big story back when it happened, because all these people were very upset that he wasn't, he didn't repent at the last moment, and people found it very disturbing. Go Hume. So the reason that I'm so interested in the moral theory of David Hume is that it is explicitly non-religious and non-supernatural. He attempted to develop a moral theory that was purely naturalistic. So, which is, again, shocking for the time in the 1700s. Hume's moral theory is based off of a particular theory of psychology. The books, his chapters are actually in that order. It starts with talking about his theory of psychology and then goes on to his moral philosophy. This theory seems very primitive now, but honestly, we still don't have a better theory hundreds of years later. So he came up with a really kind of tinker toy theory of psychology, where he had basic elements. So the basic idea in his theory of psychology is that humans have certain innate passions, what we would call emotions today. So the contemporary concept of emotions didn't exist really in the 1700s. People talked about passions and sentiments and things like that. So when you hear me talk about passion or a sentiment, really just substitute it as a motivation or emotion in your mind. But he believed that we had these innate passions, and these passions included things like desire, aversion, hope, fear, grief, and joy, and instincts, things like hunger and lust. According to Hume, intentional actions are the product of these passions. But more importantly, the only driver of any action at all in a human, this is an important part, is these passions. So you can't be driven by anything else. It has to be one of these ultimate passions. Hume disagrees with earlier philosophers that reason can be a cause to action. He attempts to demonstrate that, quote, reason alone can never be a motive of any action of the will. And this theory, so that's as much as I'm going to say about his theory of psychology, but that is enough to have a direct impact on his theory of morality. So let me explain. So prepare yourself. This is a shocking statement from David Hume. But what he says about morality, quote, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." So let me explain that quote. So that doesn't mean that Hume is after, blowing up the world. What it does mean is that you can't, given his theory of psychology, since you can't use reasons to justify actions, you can't really use reasons to determine ultimate preferences or ends. These are given to you by your nature, and then you use reason to figure out how to achieve those different ends. So the point of that statement is not to say that you should have no preference for scratching your finger over blowing up the world. The point of that statement is to say that purely by using reason, you can't come to the conclusion, you can't deduce it like a law of mathematics, that it's better to scratch your finger than blow up the world, is his general point. He's also famous for saying, quote, reason is, and not only to be, the slave of the passions. So again, it's another way of making that statement that really what drives action is not reason, but it has to be at the end of the day, whatever passions that you have. Okay, so for Hume, what makes something good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or full of vice, has nothing to do with reason. It has everything to do with our emotional reaction to things. He writes, take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you. As long as you consider the object, you can never find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast, look inside, and find a sentiment of disapprobation, which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object. So this statement was important later on for people who want to come up with naturalistic theories, especially of meta-ethics, where they're trying to come up with naturalistic theories of ethics. His claim here is that there's no fact of nature at all that makes something good or bad. It all has to do with our emotional reaction to things in the world. Luckily for us, it turns out that for the most part, people have the right emotions. Given a choice, people are not selfish monsters. Hume writes, this is my favorite Hume quote, would any man who is walking along tread as willingly on another's gouty toes, whom he has no quarrel with, as on the hard flint and pavement? So he throws that out too. The intent here is really, all things being equal, why stomp on the poor person with gouty toes, and humans in general are sympathetic. He doesn't think that they're selfish monsters who are always after their own benefit. He thinks that people have natural inclinations to help other human beings. So Hume takes this as just a fact about human nature. He writes, it is needless to push our researches so far as to ask why we have humanity or fellow feeling with others. It is sufficient that this is experienced to be a principle in human nature. We must stop somewhere in our examination of causes, and there are in every science some general principles beyond which we cannot hope to find any principle more general. Now, of course, we would push back on that today. Remember, he was writing this 100 years before Darwin published on the origin of the species, so he didn't have any sort of mechanism to talk about natural selection. So for him, understanding human nature, he didn't know where to go beyond, well, these are the basic facts of human nature. He couldn't analyze them in a deeper manner. So Hume believes that it's part of human nature to feel sympathy with others. The foundation of his morality is the idea of projecting yourself into other people's circumstances and feeling their pain and their suffering. So given that we have that ability, and this, by the way, this whole idea has been elaborated by later philosophers like Adam Smith. I also read his book over the last couple of weeks, incredibly slow and boring and awful. But I did read Adam Smith's book on where he tries to develop this theory even more around sentiment. So he's had an influence on later philosophers. He gives some evidence for that. He points out that when most people go to the theater, they're directly affected by the people on the stage, or that's true for poetry or for novels. He writes, every movement of the theater by a skillful poet is communicated as it were by magic to the spectators, who weep, tremble, resent, rejoice, and are inflamed with all the variety of passions which actuate the several personages of the drama. But finally, Hume believes that relying on our natural moral sentiments is not enough. Hume believes that our moral sentiments do need to be corrected by our judgment. And this is where we're getting into some dangerous territory, which I'll get to in a moment. But he writes, sympathy we shall allow is much fainter than our concern for ourselves, and sympathy which persons remote from us much fainter than with persons near and contiguous. But for this very reason, it is necessary for us in our calm judgments and discourse concerning the characters of men to neglect all these differences and render our sentiments more public and social. So this is an important statement, because what he's saying here is, so up to this point, he's been saying, look, morality is just based off of people's sentiments. It's based off of their feeling of joy or upsetness by projecting themselves into other people's circumstances. So it's the sharing of these moral sentiments. But he points out that, actually, you feel more about what a close friend feels than you do with someone who's, a person who lives in China, for example, and that you don't know, you don't have the same sort of direct connection with. But it seems like when we think of our ideas of virtue, that you should have the same, you should think that this person in China has the same level of virtue as the person who's sitting next to you. So this is where Hume says that to be moral, you need to take something he calls a general point of view. You need to abstract away from your particular sentiments in that situation and look at the world from the perspective of, everyone. Take a general point of view. I want to pause and really consider this idea because it's really it's been adopted by a lot of philosophers after Hume and was a basis for a lot of other moral theories. For example, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, Adam Smith's impartial spectator, John Rawls' veil of ignorance or the original position. They all derive ultimately from Hume's idea here about going from individual reactions and somehow trying to generalize and abstract away and taking a universal view instead of a particular view. So this is really the normative step. It's a step from a particular person's perspective to society's perspective. So he comes up with this idea of a general point of view because he's trying to react to this imagined objection to his overall argument concerning the sentiments. He writes, "We sympathize more with persons contiguous to us than with persons remote from us, with our acquaintances than with strangers, with our countrymen than with foreigners. But notwithstanding this variation of our sympathy, we give the same approbation to the same moral qualities in China as in England. They appear equally virtuous and recommend themselves equally to the esteem of a judicious spectator. The sympathy varies without a variation in our esteem. Our esteem, therefore, proceeds not from sympathy." So that's this counter-argument. So he's presenting this as someone making an argument against his idea that morality is not based on reason, just based off sentiments. So here's Hume's response to that argument. "Oh, 'tis the easiest matter in the world to account for it." I wish I could do a Scottish accent just to get the full Hume thing going here, but he writes, "'Tis the easiest matter in the world to account for it. Our situation, with regard both to persons and things, is in continual fluctuation, and a man that lies at a distance from us may in a little time become a familiar acquaintance. Besides, every particular man has a peculiar position with regards to others, and 'tis impossible we could ever converse together on any reasonable terms, were each of us to consider characters and persons only as they appear from his peculiar point of view. In order, therefore, to prevent those continual contradictions and arrive at a more stable judgment of things, we fix on some steady and general points of view, and always in our thoughts place ourselves in them, whatever may be our present situation. In like manner, external beauty is determined merely by pleasure, and 'tis evident a beautiful countenance cannot give so much pleasure when seen at the distance of 20 paces, as when it is brought nearer us. We say not, however, that it appears to us less beautiful, because we know what effect it will have in such a position, and by that reflection we correct its momentary appearance." So let me explain this argument here. It's actually really simple. He's pointing out that there's a beautiful woman, but she's standing 20 paces away. That doesn't make her not a beautiful woman, because we know that if she was really close, we'd say, wow, that's a beautiful woman. That's the argument. And so he's saying the same thing for morality. That, the guy in China, yeah, we're not close enough to him, but we know that if we were close enough to him, we would also respect what he was doing. We would also feel the same, moral reactions to what that person's doing. Does that make sense, that argument? So it's only correcting. It's not using reason. It's correcting your biased perception of the world through your imagination. Okay, but I want you to recognize a pretty big shift in Hume that's happening here, because here he's moving from a personal perspective, where you're just making moral judgments based off of your particular emotional reaction to things, over to a general perspective. So the importance of that shift can be illustrated by a thought experiment discussed by Alan Gibbard. So here's another thought experiment. Prepare yourself. So 2 canoes of children capsize in rapids, and a man on the bank can rescue some but not all of the children. Close to him are 2 children, and he could rescue both. Further away is his own daughter, and alternatively he could rescue her but not the other 2. Utilitarianism seems to say that, faced with this grim choice, he should rescue the 2 children rather than the one. Many people have the strong intuition that the father is morally permitted, perhaps even required by the duties of parenthood, to rescue his daughter, even though he must then let 2 children drown instead of 1. All right, so let me take a quick poll. So everyone understand the setup? 2 canoes on the river. It turns out that your daughter is in the one canoe farther away, but there's 2 kids in the canoe that's closer to you. So you can only save 1 canoe. So you have to choose one. How many saved the 2 children? Wow. Really? Whoa. So disappointed. All right. Who saves the daughter? Ada, absolutely I would. Yeah. Don't worry. Yes, all the kids have lifted their hands in the room. Smart move. Okay. So there's no question that utilitarian would say, hey, the father should save the 2 children instead of the 1 because you'd be maximizing everyone's happiness. And utilitarians always look at the world from an impersonal point of view, right? They're not supposed to take into consideration their own particular perspective on the world. Okay, but that should bother you a little, the thought experiment. I mean, it should cause you a little bit of uneasiness at the very least. Alan Gibbard extends this thought experiment to make the utilitarian conclusion seem more reasonable. Okay, so this is a little more complicated, but now imagine that there are 2 fathers, and they're about to, they have 2 canoes, they have the children, they're about to take this trip down the river, and they're going to decide what to agree about if in case there's a giant wave that goes to the river and all the canoes capsize. How are they going to handle this situation? And I guess the fathers are taking turns sleeping, so there will only be one father at the bank at the time. I don't know. That doesn't really work, but just ignore that part. So there can only be one father, and they have to both agree on what they'll do if the canoes get capsized. So there's 2 possibilities here. You can have agreement A. Both fathers just say, hey, every man for themselves. I'm going to save my own daughter. If your 2 kids are out there, then I'm sorry. They're history. I'm not going to, I'm going to put my daughter first. So that's agreement A. Save your own child. Or they can do agreement B, maximize life saved. Each father might agree to save the 2 children in the canoe closest to the riverbank and not the child in the more distant canoe. So in that case, they might end up sacrificing their own child, right? Because they'd save the 2 children in the closest canoe, which could be, that stupid sleeping father's children, and you wouldn't end up saving your children. So again, let me ask, how many people would decide to save their own child, just say, I agree to just save my own child in all circumstances? Good job. Yeah. All right. How many people would maximize a life saved? Really? Okay. All right. A lot of people put their hands up. All right. So Gibbard argues that actually for both fathers, agreement B is a better agreement. The math just works out if you think it through. The unlucky father in agreement A will lose both children, where the unlucky father in agreement B will lose a single child. Therefore, agreement B is the rational decision. And so it's because, remember, there's 2 canoes, and there's only 1 child in the canoe that's your daughter in that situation. So it works out that that the second agreement actually results in fewer children being drowned. Okay. Anyway, so in the abstract, this all sounds good. Wow. I mean, okay, utilitarians are right. They've proven it. I see it. The math works out. And when talking about other people, all this feels very, very reasonable. The problem results when push comes to shove, and you're in a situation in which you have to decide between a personal good, saving this family member, and a social good, fairness. I would argue that love of a family member trumps all consideration of fairness. I would have no reluctance to break the agreement to save my own child. So let's say this. So remember this hypothetical that's been set up here. According to this hypothetical, you're supposed to imagine that before sending your kids down the river, you agree with the other father, yes, in this situation I will do X. But now you're actually in that situation, and your kid is actually going to starve. I mean, not starve. Actually going to drown. That's, I think, honestly, I'm just going to warn everyone in this room up front, I'm breaking the agreement. Because there's a stronger motivation for me here to save my child. And that motivation, I would say, trumps all motivation of fairness or keeping my agreement. I don't care. Call me a promise breaker. Saving my child here. And so it's hard to see how anyone can actually, I can see how people would enter into an agreement like that. It's hard to see how people can actually keep it when push comes to shove. And Gibbard and Rawls are aware of this issue. Gibbard writes, if the 2 could make an agreement with full assurance that the agreement would be kept, they would agree on the arrangement that utilitarianism prescribes. In this way, utilitarianism can stem not only from motives of benevolence, but from motives of fair reciprocity. That's only though if the motivations of fair Reciprocity are never overwhelmed by other motives, and the parties have full assurance of this. So it would appear here, honestly, that Hume is better positioned to handle these types of situations than utilitarians. Because unlike a utilitarian, Hume isn't constrained to justify moral behavior by relying on a single sentiment, fairness, or I guess benevolence could be another thing that utilitarians push. Hume can weigh multiple sentiments when deciding on the right action. And Hume seems to accept that. He seems to accept that private connections, such as our personal connections with family and friends, might trump considerations of general fairness. He writes, "It is wisely ordained by nature that private connections should commonly prevail over universal views and considerations. Otherwise, our affectations and actions would be dissipated and lost for want of a proper limited object. Thus, a small benefit done to ourselves or our near friends excites more lively sentiments of love and approbation than a great benefit done to a distant commonwealth. But still we know here, as in all the senses, to correct these inequalities by reflection and retain a general standard of vice and virtue, founded chiefly on a general usefulness." So there's a lot going on. This is actually a footnote, which makes it even, a little sneakier. But there's a lot going on in this footnote that Hume has. There's been lots of articles written on this footnote because he seems to be saying two things at once. But the first thing he's saying is, he's saying it was wisely ordained by nature that we have a natural tendency to prioritize, our friends and families over distant people. And he seems to think that that's a good thing because he thinks that abstracting our affections and actions too much would result in our affections and actions being dissipated and lost. So if we care too much about what's going on in China, we don't pay enough attention to what's going on in England, and then we're less effective as human beings. But at the same time, in that same paragraph, he seems to think that prioritizing friends and family violates a general standard of virtue and vice. So really, perhaps the right way to think of what he's saying there is, it's natural, it's in our nature to want to prioritize people that we're connected with. But if we're looking at things from a general point of view, we still can't really say that's the virtuous action. From a general point of view, abstracted away from our particular place in the world, we can't say it's a virtuous action. But this, I would claim, presents a problem for Hume's overall approach to moral philosophy, because for him, the ultimate foundations of moral philosophy is in psychology, and it's in our motivations. So he can't both say that there's a general point of view that's different from our core instincts about moral emotions. Anyway, I want to stop here so we can discuss this. I just want to sum up. So I'm continue to be super sympathetic to Hume's approach to morality. I think it's the right approach to providing a foundation of morality. I think it's going through human psychology is the right way of doing it. In particular, through a theory of human motivation and emotion, and that's exactly what Hume's trying to provide. And in conclusion, if you really want to convince people not to punch bunny rabbits, then you need to appeal to people's moral sentiments and not their reason. I'm not going to punch a bunny rabbit because I'm a nice guy. Let's discuss.